The diner tasted like old grease and quiet desperation at 2 o'clock in the morning. I dragged the coffee pot along the counter for what felt like the 100th lap of the night, the tendons in my wrist burning with a dull, familiar rage. The overhead fluorescence cast everything in that sickly amber that turns skin the color of old newspaper, the kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as expose, making every crease in my uniform look like an accusation. My shoes, second-hand flats with soles worn so thin the cold bled straight through to my feet, barely made a sound on the linoleum as I moved between tables that never stayed wiped for long. The men in booth 5 hadn't touched their coffee in 20 minutes. They weren't looking at their phones. They weren't talking to each other. They were looking at him, and they had the eyes of people who had already made a decision. Naira. Table 3 wants the check. The men behind him had a language of their own, a flicker of the chin, a thumb grazing a jacket pocket, a silence that pressed differently than the ordinary kind. I caught it the way you catch a smell before you see smoke. My hand found the order pad without looking. I tore the corner clean. For words. Small enough to vanish, heavy enough to detonate. I crossed to his table with the coffee pot held like armor. He didn't look up when I leaned in. Neither did I. My fingers grazed his ink dark, cold as stone, and I left the paper folded in his palm like it was change from the register. Your men are trying to kill you. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. I know, because I counted them against the thudding in my throat. Then Malachi Vale lifted his eyes to mine, just once, just briefly, and what lived inside that look was not panic. It was not surprise. It was the quiet, terrible patience of a man who had been waiting to find out which night it would be. He already knew. He just hadn't known when. And now, because I couldn't keep my hands to myself or my conscience quiet, neither did I. The first thing that moved was his hand. Not fast, that was what unnerved me most. Malachi Vale did not lurch or flinch or reach for anything obvious. He simply set his coffee cup down with the measured patience of a man who had just decided how the rest of the evening would go, and in the same breath, his left hand dropped below the table. I was still standing there, coffee pot in hand, heart running laps inside my chest, when the booth behind him exploded into motion. The tallest one, the one with the jaw like a cinder block who had been stationed at Malachi's left shoulder all night, came up from his seat fast. Too fast. His hand was already inside his jacket when Malachi turned, and the turn itself was something I will spend a long time trying to forget. It wasn't the movement of someone reacting. It was the movement of someone conducting. Like the violence had been arranged in advance, and he was simply stepping into it. What followed happened in the space between 2 heartbeats. The cinderblock man's wrist was caught, bent, redirected, and then Malachi was standing, which meant the man was going down. And the sound his shoulder made against the diner floor tiles was the kind of sound that rearranges something small and permanent in your understanding of the world. The second guard lunged from the right. I stumbled backward into the counter, and the coffee pot left my hand. I don't remember releasing it, and it shattered somewhere near the register in a bloom of dark liquid and ceramic teeth. Someone in a back booth screamed. A chair went over. The fluorescents above us buzzed on with their idiotic indifference, bathing the whole catastrophe in that same sickly amber as though nothing warranted the dignity of darkness. The third man, the one who had been closest to the door all night, the one whose eyes I had clocked doing the most work, broke left instead of charging. Smart. He was going for distance, for angle, for the kind of position that ends arguments permanently. My mouth opened before I had any instructions for it. Left door. Malachi was already moving. I don't know what I expected from a man like that in a space that small. Something brutal, probably. Something that announced itself. What I got was efficiency so cold it barely looked like effort, 2 movements, a sound like a cabinet slamming, and the third man was on the floor beside the coat rack with his face pointed at the ceiling and no immediate plans to get up. For seconds. Maybe 5. The diner held its breath. The remaining customers, a trucker at the counter, an insomniac couple near the window, had compressed themselves as far from the booths as the walls would allow. Maria, my colleague, was a statue behind the kitchen pass-through, a dish still in her hand, her eyes the size of the plates she'd forgotten she was holding. I realized I was the only person standing in the open. Malachi turned, and the full weight of his attention arrived on me like a change in weather. He was unhurt, suit unmarked, breathing measured, and even in a way that made my own ragged gasping feel embarrassing by comparison. The ink climbing his throat, the tattoos I had clocked from a distance all night, resolved up close into something intricate and deliberate, a cartography of choices made long before tonight. His eyes were the color of deep water in a place with no light source. They moved over my face with an intelligence that felt less like being looked at and more like being read. "You saw it," he said. Not a question. My mouth was desert dry. "The way they were watching you. The hand signals." The one by the door he was positioned for. I stopped. Swallowed. Yes. Something shifted behind his expression. Not warmth. Something more clinical than warmth and more dangerous. The recalibration of a man updating a spreadsheet in real time. He looked at me for 3 more seconds with that terrible, measuring quiet. Then he reached down, straightened his jacket lapel, and said, very simply, "Get your bag." I blinked. "I'm sorry. Your bag." His eyes moved to the back of the room and back to me without urgency. "Coat, if you have one. Whatever you came here with tonight." A pause. "You have approximately 90 seconds before more of them arrive, and when they do, the first thing they will do is ask the staff what they saw. You understand what happens after that?" The blood left my face in a single, clean drop. I understood. I understood with a horrible, crystalline clarity that had nothing to do with the crime dramas I'd half-watched on late nights, and everything to do with the look in the eyes of those 3 men before any of this started. I was a witness. Not a bystander, not a confused civilian, a witness, the specific and non-transferable kind, the kind that creates a problem requiring a solution. "I have a shift," I said, which was possibly the most useless thing I had ever said in my life. "You had a shift." He was already moving toward the door, unhurried, a man navigating a schedule. He paused at the entrance and turned back, and the look he gave me contained something I couldn't fully name. Not mercy exactly, not concern, but perhaps a recognition that what he was about to do to my life was not nothing, and that he was doing it anyway. "I'm not asking, miss," he waited. "Soul," I heard myself say. "Naira Soul. Miss Soul." He held the door open against the cold that breathed in from the street, and his voice was the calmest thing in the room, which was perhaps the most frightening thing about it. "I'm not asking." I grabbed my bag. I don't know what I thought walking out of that diner meant. Some part of me, the part that had survived 24 years on luck, stubbornness, and the ability to make myself small in difficult rooms, told me there was still a version of this where I gave a statement, went home, and woke up to the same Tuesday I'd been dreading, the same rent notice on the kitchen table, the same blood debt with my name on it. That there was still an exit. That part of me had clearly not been paying attention to the evening. The SUV outside was black, idling, and occupied by 2 men who did not have the faces of people employed in legitimate industries. The back door was open before I reached the curb. Malachi slid in beside me with the ease of a man returning to a familiar seat, and the door closed, and the city began to move past the tinted windows in smeared amber and sodium light, and I sat with my bag on my lap and my pulse in my ears and the slow, nauseating understanding settling over me like cold water. I had saved his life. And he had taken mine, not violently, not cruelly, but with the absolute and unhesitating authority of a man who did not distinguish between the things he owned and the things he had simply decided to keep. I stared at the back of the headrest in front of me and thought, with a strange, hollow calm, you should have let them shoot him. I hadn't, though. And now here we both were. The elevator didn't announce floors. It simply rose, silent, pressurized, sealed, and the sensation was less like ascending and more like the world falling away beneath you, taking all its familiar reference points with it. The two men who had flanked us in the lobby did not follow us in. They stepped back as the doors closed with the quiet obedience of people who understood which spaces were not theirs to occupy. That should have been a comfort. It wasn't. I watched the floors climb in the slim digital display above the doors and concentrated on keeping my breathing even. Malachi Vale stood beside me and said nothing. He didn't fidget. Didn't check his phone. Didn't perform the small social rituals people use to fill silence when they're standing close to a stranger. He simply existed in the space with a stillness so complete it felt less like calm and more like a climate. The doors opened directly into the apartment. I have cleaned enough tables and enough rooms to understand the difference between money and wealth, between the loud, fragile kind that announces itself on every surface and the kind so settled in its own permanence that it doesn't need to say anything at all. The penthouse was the second kind. The ceilings were the first thing, high and coffered, pale stone the color of bone, lit from below by fixtures that produced no visible source, just light that seemed to originate from the architecture itself. The far wall was entirely glass. The city spread beyond it like a circuit board, a million amber and white points of signals stretching to the horizon, indifferent and enormous. I stood at the threshold and felt, acutely, the specific smallness of a person who has spent their life at floor level looking at things from the underside. "Sit," Malachi said, moving past me toward the kitchen island without looking back. I sat, because the alternative required more spine than I currently had access to. The sofa was the kind of furniture that costs more than most people's yearly rent, low, cream-colored, obscenely soft, and sinking into it felt like a mild betrayal of every surface I had ever slept on. He returned with 2 glasses of water. Set one in front of me, kept the other and remained standing, and the asymmetry of that, him upright, me seated, him at ease in this room that was built around his dimensions, was not accidental. Men like Malachi Vale did not do anything accidentally. "Tell me what you saw," he said. I wrapped both hands around the glass. "I already told you. You told me the outcome. I want the sequence." He set his own glass down and moved to the window, hands clasped at the small of his back, looking out at the city with the proprietary ease of a man surveying an inventory. "From the beginning. When did you first notice something was wrong?" I thought about lying. The impulse lasted perhaps half a second before I recognized it as the kind of luxury I could no longer afford. "When they came in," I said. "The 3 of them. They sat flanking you, which is normal for security. But they ordered nothing. Not water, not coffee. People who are working a room will order something. It keeps them looking like they belong. A beat. They didn't care about looking like they belonged." He didn't turn around. "Go on." "The one by the door, the one with the gray jacket." He chose a seat facing outward. "Not facing you. That's not a protection position. That's a containment position." He was watching the exits. I paused. About 20 minutes in, the tall one touched his lapel. Just once. And the one in the middle shifted his weight to his right foot and didn't shift back. I stopped. That's when I tore the paper. The silence stretched. When Malachi finally turned, his expression had not changed in any way I could consciously identify, and yet it was different. The measurement behind his eyes had intensified into something that felt almost like discomfort, the expression of a man confronting an answer that requires him to revise a question he thought was already closed. "Where did you learn that?" he said. It was not phrased as a question. I didn't learn it anywhere. I searched for the right word. I watch people. I've always watched people. In my job, you learn to read a table before you approach it. You learn which customers want efficiency and which ones want conversation, which ones are about to argue, which ones are already drunk. I looked down at the glass in my hands. I learned to read the room because the room was usually the only warning I was going to get. Something moved behind his expression at that brief, almost imperceptible, like a current under still water. He didn't pursue it. Instead, he straightened, rolled one shirt sleeve to the elbow with the mechanical efficiency of a man settling in for work, and said, "3 of my senior security detail attempted to execute me tonight using a coordinated signal sequence." That sequence was either prearranged at a level requiring sustained planning, or it was triggered remotely, meaning there is still an active command structure operating from within my organization. He said it the way you'd report a fault in the building's heating system, factual, dispassionate, oriented entirely toward resolution. You identified that sequence. I did not. I absorbed this. You're not going to ask me how I missed it. I'm telling you I missed it. The question of how is not useful to me right now. His eyes met mine with a directness that had no warmth in it and no cruelty either, just the flat, functional appraisal of someone deciding what a resource is worth. What is useful is that you have a perceptual capability that apparently functions in environments where my trained people's does not. I'm a waitress, I said. The words came out smaller than I intended. You were a waitress. He moved away from the window, unhurried, toward the hallway beyond the kitchen. There is a room at the end of the hall. Guest suite. It has a lock, which you're welcome to use. He paused without turning. There is also no way out of this building that doesn't route through my security desk, so the lock is more for your peace of mind than anything practical. I stared at his back. You can't keep me here. I'm not keeping you anywhere. He glanced back, and there was something in his expression that might, in different lighting, in a different life, have approached Rye. I'm offering you a room for the night, Miss Soul. Because the alternative is sending you back out there with the working knowledge that 3 of my men tried to have me killed, and watching what happens when whoever gave that order realizes you exist. A pause. You're welcome to prefer the alternative. I said nothing. He turned back toward the hallway. There's a second thing, I said, before I could decide not to. He stopped. One of them, the one in the middle. When he looked at you, before any of it started, I pressed my thumbnail into my palm, grounding myself. He didn't look like someone about to do a job. He looked like someone settling a score. I held his gaze when he turned. Whatever this is, it isn't business. It's personal. The room was very quiet. Malachi Vale looked at me for a long, unreadable moment, the look of a man standing at the edge of a conclusion he had been avoiding. Then he nodded once, with the contained gravity of someone filing away information that changes the shape of everything, and walked down the hall without another word. I sat in the obscene softness of the sofa, in the city-lit dark of a room that wasn't mine, and realized with a cold, full-bodied clarity that I hadn't saved myself tonight. I had only changed the nature of the danger. I didn't sleep. I lay on a bed that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent, staring at a ceiling so flawlessly white it felt accusatory, and listened to the penthouse breathe around me. The guest suite was immaculate in the way of rooms that have never held a person long enough to leave a mark, no creases in the curtains, no water rings on the nightstand, no evidence that anyone had ever been uncertain or afraid within these walls. Everything designed to communicate safety. Nothing that actually produced it. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up and sat at the edge of the bed with my phone in my lap. 11 missed calls. 7 from a number I knew by heart and answered less and less. 3 from the diner, Maria, probably, or the night manager compiling the incident report that was going to end my employment before sunrise. And 1 from a blocked number that had left no voicemail and needed none, because I knew exactly who it belonged to and exactly what the silence meant. The debt collectors for my father's account did not leave messages. They left absences. Gaps. The sound of a door closing that you hadn't heard open. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until the darkness went geometric. My father had been a man of tremendous charm and catastrophically poor judgment, a combination I had spent my entire life paying the administrative costs of. The debt he'd left behind when he disappeared 3 years ago was not the ordinary kind, not the kind you negotiated with banks or restructured with lawyers. It was the kind written in a different ink, enforced by different methods, in rooms that didn't have official addresses. 40,000, compounding at a rate that had no legal name, owed to a man named Reyes who ran his collections operation out of a dry-cleaning front in the East Quarter and had never once raised his voice when he explained what happened to families who ran out of time. I had been running out of time for 8 months. I was still sitting there, phone face down, when the knock came. Not the door of the guest suite. The subtle, structural knock of someone who has used their knuckles on enough doors to know that authority doesn't need volume. I opened it. Malachi was already dressed, or perhaps had never undressed. It was difficult to imagine him as someone who required unconsciousness to function, in dark trousers and a shirt with the top button open, sleeves still rolled. He was holding a tablet. His expression was the same operating temperature as always, cool, functional, and arranged in a way that gave nothing away for free. "Come," he said, and turned toward the main room before I had confirmed I would. The kitchen island had become a workspace. 2 laptops, a series of printed photographs arrayed with deliberate spacing, a coffee that was already half gone. He had been up for hours. I wondered if he had slept at all, and then looked at his eyes and had my answer. He did not offer me coffee, but it was already on the counter in a second cup, black, and I chose to read that as something. "Your name turned up in an adjacent search," he said, pulling up something on the tablet and turning it to face me across the island. I looked at the screen. My chest contracted. It was a debt ledger. My father's name at the top, Dominic Soul, and below it a column of figures that had compounded beyond anything I could assemble in a single lifetime. Cross-referenced with my current address, my employment record, a photograph taken outside the diner that I did not remember being taken. "Reyes," I said. "Reyes." Malachi set the tablet down. "Who operates his collection enforcement through a network that has done contracted work for 3 of the 4 crime families in this city." He paused. "Including, on 2 occasions, mine." The kitchen was very quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the remote murmur of the city 40 floors below. "How long?" he said. 8 months since the last extension." I kept my voice level through an actival I could feel in my back teeth. "Original debt belonged to my father. He's gone. He left it, and he left us, and the interest doesn't care about that particular detail." "How much?" I told him. Malachi's expression did not change. For a man who dealt in figures that would have made my debt look like loose change in a car seat, the number clearly registered as an operational rather than emotional quantity. He picked up his coffee, set it back down. "Your father's name," he said slowly, with a new quality in his voice, deliberate, careful, the verbal equivalent of a hand placed flat on a surface to test its temperature. "Dominic Soul." "Yes." Something moved behind his eyes. A door opening briefly onto a room I wasn't permitted to see, then closing again. He didn't pursue it. "Not yet. I have a problem," he said instead, "that requires a specific capability. You demonstrated that capability tonight in a way that my current personnel, despite their training, despite their cost, demonstrably cannot replicate." He moved around the island with the measured pace of a man presenting a proposal he has already decided on but is extending the courtesy of framing. "I have traders still operating within my organization. I don't know how many. I don't know which tier they occupy. What I know is that they are professionals, which means they've been performing normalcy for a sustained period, and that the people responsible for identifying abnormal behavior in my ranks have failed to detect them." He stopped across the counter from me. "You read 3 men in a diner in under 20 minutes without any prior intelligence, any training, or any personal stake until the final moment." His eyes were direct and entirely without sentiment. "I need you inside my operation. Gatherings. Meetings. The kind of events where the people I need to identify will be present and performing." A pause. "Not as staff. As someone they have reason to dismiss. Someone they look through rather than at." I understood immediately what he meant and found that understanding deeply uncomfortable. You want me to be invisible, I said. You already are. I'm simply asking you to be useful while you're at it. I looked at the ledger still open on the tablet. At my father's name. At the figure below it that had been shortening my future 1 month at a time. And if I do this, I said carefully, if I identify your traitors, the debt is settled. No hesitation. No elaboration. The word of a man for whom the currency was negligible and the principle of the transaction was the only thing worth discussing. Completely. Reyes receives a communication from a source he will not question and does not refuse, and Dominic Soul's account is closed. Permanently. The offer landed in the silence and sat there, enormous and clean-edged, the way truly dangerous things often are. I thought about the blocked number on my phone. About the photograph on his tablet taken outside my diner, my address already in someone's file. About the fact that invisible and safe were not the same word, but that right now, for the first time in 8 months, they were at least in the same room. I want it in writing, I said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, the outline where a smile would live in a man who had more reasons to produce them. You're in no position to negotiate, Miss Soul. I'm in the only position I have, I said. And you need what I can do. Which means we're both in it. The ghost at the corner of his mouth deepened by 1 fraction. He reached across the island and turned the tablet toward himself and began to type. The dress was not mine in any sense of the word. It had been delivered to the guest suite at noon in a flat black box with no branding and no note, just the garment itself, midnight blue silk that moved like water poured slowly over itself, and a pair of heels that added 4 inches I had no business owning. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time and looked at the version of myself the dress produced and tried to locate the waitress from the diner somewhere inside her. She was there, I thought. Just buried under the kind of surface that cost enough to make people stop asking questions about what was underneath. Malachi was waiting in the main room when I came out. He looked up from the documents he was reading, and something happened in the half-second before his expression returned to its default operating temperature, a brief, involuntary recalibration, the visual equivalent of a missed step. He recovered it immediately, smoothed it back into the flat, functional assessment I had already learned to read as his version of a resting face. But I had caught it, the way I caught things, quietly and without announcement, and I filed it away in the part of myself I kept below the waterline. The event is a private dinner, he said, returning his attention to the documents. 40 guests. 6 of them are individuals I have reason to suspect. 3 others are adjacent. They may have knowledge without direct involvement. He set the papers down. You are not there as an observer. You're there as mine. That framing matters because it places you in proximity to every conversation without requiring explanation. As yours, I repeated. It is a role, Miss Soul. Perform it accordingly. The car ride was 20 minutes of city lights and the kind of silence that has texture, not comfortable, not hostile, but aware. Malachi sat beside me with 2 inches of space between us that felt architectural, deliberate, like a border drawn with surveying equipment. He reviewed something on his phone. I watched the city stream past the window and rehearsed the names he had briefed me on that afternoon, matching faces from photographs to the behaviors he had described, building a mental map I could navigate without appearing to navigate it. Don't stare, he said, without looking up from his phone. I wasn't going to. You were constructing a methodology. I could see it. A pause. At this level, people are trained to identify people who are paying attention. The advantage you had in the diner was that no one thought a waitress was worth noticing. Tonight they will notice you, which means you need to be worth noticing for only one reason. I turned from the window. And what reason is that? He looked up then, and the city light moving across the glass shifted the shadows on his face in a way that made the tattoo climbing his throat look less like ink and more like something organic, something that had always been part of the architecture. His eyes held mine for a moment with that flat, oceanic quality that gave nothing away for free. "Me," he said simply, and returned to his phone. The venue was a private members club in the upper quarter, the kind of building that had no sign outside because the people invited already knew where it was and everyone else was not invited. Inside, it was dark wood and amber candlelight and the specific humidity of a room full of expensive cologne and older money. A string quartet moved through something mournful and elegant in the far corner. Waitstaff, real ones, the kind who had trained for rooms like this, moved between guests with the practiced invisibility I knew from the other side. Malachi's hand found the small of my back at the entrance. It was a light touch. Deliberate, professional, the gesture of a man who had made the calculation that physical contact communicated the necessary narrative most efficiently. I understood this. I had agreed to this. I kept my expression composed and my posture easy and told the part of my nervous system currently staging a small internal emergency that it was mistaken about the significance of a hand. It was not mistaken. We moved through the room, and I did what I was there to do. I watched, I listened, I let my eyes drift with the casual, unfocused quality of a woman slightly bored by the company and entirely absorbed in her own contentment. I found 3 of the 6 faces from the photographs within the first 10 minutes. I tracked their sightlines without tracking them. I noted who they greeted and how, which handshakes carried weight and which were performance, who looked at Malachi when they thought he wasn't looking and what lived in that look when they did. The 4th face I found was standing too close to the bar exit, watching the door. Malachi's hand was still at my back when I leaned up and turned my face toward his jaw and said very quietly, against the shell of his ear, "Gray suit. Left of the bar. He's counting your security rotations." I felt rather than heard the slight shift in his breathing. His response was to turn toward me, and the movement closed the 2 inches between us into something that no longer had a number. His hand moved from the small of my back to my waist, and the adjustment was, technically, a mechanical correction, repositioning for the angle of the conversation, for the optics of the room. I catalogued these facts with the disciplined clarity of a person determined to be sensible about a situation. His eyes were very close. "How long has he been counting?" Malachi said, low, the words directed at me, but his attention fractured, part here, part calculating the room over my shoulder with that terrible, quiet precision. "Since we walked in," I said. He recognized the pattern when your second man crossed the room. He's mapping coverage gaps. A pause in which neither of us moved. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." His gaze dropped once, briefly, involuntarily, the same kind of recalibration I had caught in the apartment, and came back up, and this time the operating temperature was not entirely recovered. Something had gotten through the insulation. Something small and inconvenient, and not accounted for in any agreement we had signed that morning. "Don't look at me like that," I said quietly. "Like what?" "Like you're surprised I'm a person." Something crossed his face. Not quite humor, not quite discomfort, but the compound of both that happens when someone says the precise thing you are not prepared for. His jaw shifted. His hand at my waist did not move. "I'm not surprised," he said, after a moment. "I'm recalibrating." "Recalibrating what?" He looked at me steadily, and the candlelight did what it did to his face, and the quartet moved through something that swelled and then softened. And the room continued its elegant performance around us, entirely unaware that something in the 2 inches of recovered distance between us had quietly and irrevocably collapsed. "The scope," he said, "of what this arrangement requires me to be careful about." I held his gaze and felt the warning in it land, directed not at me, but at himself, which was somehow the more unsettling version. I turned back toward the room, toward the gray suit, toward the job. But the hand at my waist did not move, and I did not ask it to. The name surfaced 3 days later, the way drowned things do, not announced, not invited, simply rising to the top of still water and refusing to submerge again. "I was in the study when it happened." Malachi had given me access to the room that morning with the wordless pragmatism that had come to characterize the way he extended things, no ceremony, no explanation, just the door left open and the implication that I was expected to use it. I had spent 4 hours cross-referencing attendance records from the dinner against the security rotation logs he'd pulled, building a timeline of the gray-suited man's movements backward through 6 months of event appearances. It was painstaking and quiet, and it turned out I was good at it, which surprised me less than it probably should have. I was so absorbed that I didn't hear Malachi come in. "Dominic Soul," he said, from somewhere behind me. I went very still. Not the way you go still when you're startled. The way you go still when a sound reaches you from a direction you didn't know how to source, when the air pressure in a room changes and you understand, before you have processed any specific information, that something load-bearing is about to shift. I set down the pen I was holding and turned in the chair. He was standing in the doorway with a file in his hand, physical, printed, the kind of documentation that predated the digital era and had been kept that way on purpose. His face was arranged in its usual careful neutrality, but there was something underneath it tonight that I had not seen before. Something older than his operational temperament. Something that had been sitting in a room inside him for a long time before this conversation. "You knew my father," I said. Not a question. I knew of him. He crossed to the desk and set the file down in front of me, open to a page with a photograph paper-clipped to the corner. My father's face, younger than I remembered it, caught in what looked like a surveillance still. He was shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize. He worked as a financial intermediary for 3 years, moving capital between the Vail operation and a series of legitimate holding companies. Clean, efficient, largely invisible. I looked at the photograph, at the familiar angle of my father's jaw, at his easy smile, directed at a man whose identity I didn't yet know and already dreaded. "Largely," I said. "In his final year, he began diverting." Malachi's voice was even. Professionally, clinically even, in a way that told me the evenness was a structural decision and not a natural condition. Small amounts initially, the kind that read as rounding errors. Then larger. Then systematically. Over 14 months, he redirected approximately $800,000 from bail accounts into a private channel we traced, eventually, to a man named Cashin Reyes. The name hit me like a palm flat against a table. "Reyes," I said. "Your father was not simply a debtor to Reyes. He was a contractor." Malachi watched my face with the careful attention of a man who is simultaneously delivering information and measuring its seismic impact. "The debt you have been servicing, the debt you came here carrying, was not a loan. It was a cover structure. A way of maintaining a claim on you as leverage, in the event that the original transaction ever surfaced." The study was very quiet. I thought about the block number. About the photograph taken outside my diner. About 8 months of compounding interest on a figure that had never been about money at all. The shape of my father's disappearance rearranged itself inside my understanding, less abandonment, more extraction. A man not running from his family, but running from the consequences of what he had built, leaving the bill in our name because we were smaller and slower and couldn't follow him to wherever people like that go when the architecture collapses. "He used us," I said. The words came out flat. I had spent years being angry at my father in a hot, formless way, the anger of someone who has been left. This was different. This was cold and specific and had corners. He used everyone available to him. Malachi closed the file without looking at it, including my father. I looked up. "The man in the photograph," he said. "That is Marcus Vail. My father. Taken 8 months before Dominic Soul disappeared and Marcus Vail died of a cardiac event that 3 of his physicians subsequently declined to sign off on without qualification." The silence was enormous. "You think my father?" "I think Reyes used your father as an instrument, and I think the stress of what he participated in contributed to consequences that went beyond financial." His voice did not change temperature, but something in the room did. "I am not holding you responsible for actions taken before you were old enough to be implicated. I want to be precise about that. But you're telling me, I said carefully, so that I understand what I'm standing in the middle of. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the ground you're standing on. He moved to the window, his default position when something required containment, I had noticed. The city lay below in its indifferent sprawl. And because what I'm about to ask you to do next involves Reyes directly, and you needed the full architecture before I could ask it honestly. I sat with the information and let it settle into the existing structure of what I knew about my life, watching the way it changed the load distribution of everything. My father's death. My father's disappearance. The years of scarcity that had followed, my mother's silences, my own compulsive vigilance, the way I had trained myself to read rooms because rooms were the only warning I was going to get. Not random poverty. Not simple bad luck. A deliberate consequence of choices made in this world, in this particular shadow, by a man who had shared my last name and not much else. I don't know what I feel about him, I said, mostly to myself. My father. Malachi turned from the window. You're allowed not to know. His voice had shifted barely, fractionally, the temperature differential of a single degree, but in a man whose range was this narrow, a degree was significant. The information doesn't require an immediate emotional verdict. I looked at him across the room, this man built from the same world that had consumed my father, wearing its marks on his skin in permanent ink, running its machinery with his bare hands. The same world. Entirely different gravity. Does it change things, I asked. Between us. Knowing where my father's choices landed. He was quiet for a moment that had real weight. It changes the context, he said finally. It doesn't change the assessment. Of what? His eyes held mine across the study, and the candlelight from the single lamp on the desk moved between us and did what light did in this man's presence, found the angles, deepened the lines, made him look like something carved rather than born. Of you, he said. I held that word in the space between us and felt it do something to the careful, contractual distance I had been maintaining since the dinner. Felt it put pressure on the architecture of sensible arrangements and professional agreements, and the extremely reasonable position that none of this was anything other than a transaction. The architecture held. Barely. But we both heard it creak. The gala was the kind of event that required a different kind of invisible. Not the invisibility of staff, that particular erasure I knew from the inside, the way you learn to move through a room carrying things without registering as a person carrying them. This was the invisibility of belonging so completely that no one thought to look twice. The invisibility of a woman in a room full of powerful men who had decided, on the basis of one silk dress and one man's hand at her back, that she was decoration. Decorative things did not get interrogated. Decorative things did not get remembered in witness statements. I had spent 4 days learning how to wear it. The venue was a converted estate an hour outside the city, the kind of property that absorbed sound and light and consequence equally, set back from a private road behind iron gates that had no intercom because the people invited already had the code. Inside, 300 guests moved through chandelier light and string music and the low, layered conversation of people who conducted their real business in the silences between sentences. I had a champagne glass I didn't drink from and a position at Malachi's left shoulder that I had calibrated to read as adoring without requiring eye contact, which freed my peripheral vision entirely. I had identified 2 new faces within the first hour. The first was a woman, unexpected, which I suspected was deliberate. Mid-40s, copper hair pinned with architectural precision, a laugh deployed with the timing of someone who had practiced it. She had shaken Malachi's hand at the entrance with warmth so complete and performative that I had felt the falseness of it from 6 feet away like a change in air pressure. Her eyes, in the half-second before the smile reached them, had done a fast, involuntary sweep of his torso. Not attraction. Assessment. She was checking for armor. I filed it. Said nothing. Watched. The second face was a man I recognized from the attendance records, someone who had been adjacent in the ledger, not a confirmed traitor but a probable one. who had attended 4 of the same events as the gray-suited man from the dinner and had never once appeared in the same photograph. Deliberate physical separation. The kind that required coordination. I was cataloging the geometry of their movements: copper hair to the east corridor, adjacent man to the terrace, the angle between them consistent enough to suggest a meeting point when the lights went out. Not a power failure. A power failure has a moment of surprise, a collective intake of breath, the brief social comedy of 300 people reaching for their phones simultaneously. This was different. This was a cut clean, intentional, total, and in the half-second of absolute darkness, before the emergency lighting bled in from the floor strips, I heard rather than saw the movement to my right. I grabbed Malachi's arm. He was already turning, already reacting, the reflexes of a man who had survived enough rooms to trust his nervous system over his eyes. But the angle was wrong and the space was crowded, and the emergency lights chose that moment to resolve the darkness into something worse than dark, red-tinged, directional, full of shadows that moved with purpose. The sound was not a gunshot. It was softer than that, which meant suppressed, which meant planned, which meant multiple people in this room had known this was happening tonight, and I had not found all of them. Malachi staggered. Not far, a single step, his weight redistributing with the controlled violence of a man overriding a body that wanted to go down. His hand found my shoulder and gripped it, and I took the weight without thinking, without deciding, the way you catch something that falls before the decision to catch it has cleared the conscious mind. "How bad?" I said, against his jaw. "Left side." His voice was intact. Controlled. The voice of someone treating pain as administrative. Through and through, I think. Move. We moved. I had spent the previous afternoon walking the estate's floor plan, not because anyone had asked me to, but because I had been a waitress long enough to know that you always learn the exits before you need them. Service corridors, staff access routes, the geometry of how a building breathes when the front of house is performing and the back of house is keeping everything alive. I knew where the kitchen was. I knew the loading dock beyond it. I knew that the security team's exterior rotation created a 40-second gap on the east side every 12 minutes because I had watched it on the approach and counted. I steered Malachi left, away from the main corridor filling with guests and noise, and the chaotic good intentions of people who would slow us down and provide cover for anyone still tracking his position. "There are more of them," he said, as we moved through the service door. "I know. Copper hair and the man from the terrace, they were coordinating. I don't know how many below them." I shouldered the door to the back corridor and held it. "Can you walk without me?" "I can walk." He did steadily, jaw set, one hand pressed to his left side with the focused pressure of a man keeping a mechanical problem from escalating. The blood was dark through his shirt. Not catastrophic. Not nothing. The kind of wound that had a window, and the window was not generous. The kitchen was empty. The staff had moved toward the commotion the way people do, pulled by noise and the social gravity of crisis. We crossed it without being seen. The loading dock door was alarmed, but the alarm panel was the same manufacturer as the penthouse service entrance, and I had watched Malachi's security team reset it twice. I reset it. He looked at me in the red-tinged light with an expression I had not seen on him before, not the recalibration, not the measuring assessment, but something that sat deeper and quieter than both of those. Something that did not have a professional application. "The panel," he said. "I pay attention," I said. "Car." We made the exterior in 40 seconds. His driver had the car moving before the door was fully closed, already on the radio, already executing the contingency that Malachi's teams apparently had prepared for the possibility that their employer might need to leave a venue horizontally. I sat beside him in the back seat and pressed my folded jacket against his side with both hands, and he let me, which told me more about the wound than his voice had. The city came back up around us, amber and indifferent. "The copper-haired woman," Malachi said, after a long moment. "Her name is Sarah Voss." She has been my director of external relations for 4 years. I kept the pressure even. You trusted her. I did. A pause that had real weight, the weight of something that had been true for a long time and was now permanently past tense. She was my father's recommendation. The sentence landed in the car and sat there, and I understood immediately what it meant in the revised architecture of everything we had discussed in the study: Reyes, the photograph, Marcus Vale's contested death. The infection had not started with the guards in the diner. It had been growing in the organization for years, patient and careful, fed from a source that had begun long before Malachi inherited the chair. His eyes found mine in the dark of the car. You saw her before the lights went out, he said. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I was still building the confirmation. I needed the pattern, not just the instinct. I stopped. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry. He looked at me for a long moment, hand still over mine where it pressed against his side, the city light sliding across his face in the familiar way that did the familiar thing to his expression, and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. You got me out, he said finally. Not absolution, not exactly. Something more durable than absolution. Recognition. I held his gaze and felt the last remaining pretense of distance between us, the professional fiction that this was a transaction, that I was a resource, that the hand beneath his was a mechanic performing maintenance, dissolve quietly and completely into the dark of the moving car. I didn't name it, but I stopped pretending it wasn't there. He didn't go to a hospital. I hadn't expected him to, but I had made the case anyway, in the car, with the focused persistence of someone who understood they were going to lose the argument and intended to lose it on record. He had listened with his eyes closed and his head resting against the seat, and when I finished he said, simply, that there was a physician who made house calls and that she had been doing so for 12 years without asking questions that weren't medically relevant. And that was the end of the hospital conversation. Dr. Ewan arrived at the penthouse 40 minutes after we did, small, unhurried, carrying a bag that suggested she had packed for exactly this category of evening. She worked on Malachi at the kitchen island with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of someone who had long since metabolized the gap between this and a clinic, and I stayed in the room because he didn't ask me to leave and I found I couldn't make myself. I watched her work and watched him endure it, jaw set, breathing measured, the same administrative relationship with pain I had observed in the car, and thought about the 4 years Sarah Voss had spent inside his trust, inside his father's recommendation, inside the architecture of everything he had built on the assumption that the foundation was sound. When Dr. Ewan left, she said he needed to stay still and that she would take it as a personal affront if he didn't. He said nothing, which she appeared to interpret as agreement. I walked her to the elevator, and when I came back he had moved from the kitchen island to the sofa, which was either compliance or a technicality, and was sitting with his eyes on the city in the dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the chair at the far end of the sofa, not beside him, not removed, a middle distance that felt honest about what the evening had produced without making declarations neither of us was prepared to file. And for a while we existed in the particular quiet of two people who have been through something together and have not yet decided what to do with that fact. It hurts, I said eventually. Not a question. Yes. No qualifier, no performance of otherwise. The most unguarded single syllable I had heard from him. I looked at his hands where they rested on his knees, the ink climbing from his fingers to his wrists, branching up his forearms, the continuation of whatever narrative lived beneath his shirt collar and resolved into the cartography at his throat. I had been in proximity to those tattoos for 10 days now and had catalogued them in the way I catalogued everything, quietly and without announcement, but had never asked. It had felt like a room with a closed door, present, significant, not yet mind open. Tell me about them, I said. He turned his head from the window. The tattoos, I said. You don't have to. I stopped. We have time tonight, and I'd rather hear your voice than the city. Something shifted in his face. The door I had been reading as closed turned out to be unlocked. He looked down at his left hand, turned it over slowly, the way you turn a page you've read enough times that the words have become something else, not information anymore, but texture. "This one," he said, and indicated the ink at his wrist, dense linework that resolved, at close distance, into a series of interlocking geometric forms. My mother drew it. Not this version, she drew it on paper when I was 7, trying to explain to me how she understood the world. Everything connected to everything else. No isolated points. A pause. She died the following year. I had it put here when I was 19 because I wanted it somewhere I'd see it every day without having to look for it. I said nothing. I had learned, with him, that silence after something real was more respectful than filling it. The script at my throat. His hand moved upward, and his fingers traced the line of text I had read in fragments and never in full. "It's from a letter my father wrote me when I was 12. The year he decided what I was going to become." His voice was even, but the evenness had a different quality now, not the professional containment I had learned to read, but something older and more manual, the evenness of a person who has been maintaining a thing for a long time by hand. He wrote, the closest translation is something like, "A man who fears his own shadow will never learn which direction the light is coming from." He meant it as instruction. I had it written here so that I would have to wear his expectations against my own pulse. A beat. The relationship to it has changed over time. "How?" I said quietly. He looked at me across the dark room, and the city light from the window did the thing it always did to his face, found the planes, deepened the lines, made him look like something that had been shaped by pressure over a very long time. "It started as obligation," he said. "It became something more like a reminder that I survived the instruction. That I built something from it that is mine, not his. That the light he was pointing me toward and the light I eventually found were not the same source." He paused. It took me a long time to understand that those were two different sentences. I thought about my father. About the debt written in his name that I had worn against my own pulse for 8 months, not in ink, but in the specific, constant weight of something that lived between your shoulder blades and never fully put itself down. About the ways we carry the people who made us, or failed to, long after the carrying stops being a choice. "My father left me a debt," I said. "Yours left you an empire." I looked at my hands. Neither of us asked for what we inherited. He was quiet for a moment that had the quality of something being considered with real seriousness. "No," he said. "But you chose what to do with yours." I looked up. "You could have ignored what you saw in that diner," he said. "The note cost you everything you had. You had no reason, no logical, self-interested reason, to put it in my hand." He held my gaze with that directness that had stopped feeling like assessment and started feeling like something else, something that looked at you rather than through you. That was a choice, not an inheritance. The city murmured 40 floors below, and the room held us in its dark, and I felt something happening in the space between the chair and the sofa, not the collapse of a distance, not the drama of a crossing, but something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The slow recognition, mutual and unannounced, that the person across the room was not what you had initially filed them as. That the categories you had arrived with were no longer the right size. I got up from the chair. I crossed to the sofa and sat beside him, not close enough to require explanation, not far enough to be a statement, and looked at the city with him in the dark, and after a moment his hand, ink-covered and careful, found mine on the cushion between us, and did not perform anything about it. Neither did I. We sat like that while the city ran through its frequencies below us, and the wound in his side did what wounds do, reminded him, steadily, that he was a person and not a mechanism. And somewhere in the quiet I understood that the man I had been afraid of in the diner and the man sitting beside me now were not two different men. He had always been this. The monster and the cartography. The ice and the 7-year-old boy whose mother drew geometry to explain the world. I had just needed to stay in the room long enough to see both at the same time. I woke to silence, which was wrong. The penthouse had a sound signature I had memorized without meaning to: the low cycling of the climate system, the distant compression of the elevator mechanism, the two-man security rotation that passed the main corridor every 18 minutes with footsteps I had cataloged by weight and gait. Malachi's lead man walked heavier on the left. His partner had a slight drag on the right heel. I knew the rhythm of this building the way I had known the rhythm of the diner, not because I had studied it, but because I was a person who lived in her ears when her eyes had nothing to do. At 3 a.m. the rhythm stopped. I was sitting up before I had consciously processed why. The blanket falling away, the dark of the guest suite resolving around me into its familiar geometry. I sat still and listened and heard the specific quality of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the suppression of it, the silence of people trying very hard not to be heard, which is an entirely different acoustic from the silence of an empty room. I was at Malachi's door in 12 seconds. I didn't knock. I opened it, and he was already awake, already sitting at the edge of the bed with the controlled alertness of a man whose nervous system had been on a light trigger for 30 years. His eyes found me in the dark, and the question in them lasted half a second before he read my face and replaced it with the answer. "How many?" he said. "I don't know yet. Your corridor team is gone. I can't hear the rotation." I moved to the window at the far side of the room and looked down at the street. 2 vehicles I hadn't seen before, lights off, positioned at angles that covered the building's main exits. At least 2 teams outside. They're not here to negotiate. He was already reaching for his phone. It showed no signal, a single bar that flickered and died. He looked at it with the expression of a man confirming a hypothesis he had not wanted to be correct about. "They've jammed the building," he said. "Then they have someone inside who knows your infrastructure." I turned from the window. "Sarah Voss." "Yes." He set the phone down. She would have the access architecture, the security rotation schedules, the signal frequencies, the team assignments. His jaw shifted. For years of it. I thought about the copper hair and the deployed laugh and the eyes that had checked his torso for armor at the entrance of the gala, and felt the particular cold of a betrayal that had been patient enough to feel like loyalty right up until the moment it didn't. "The service shaft," I said. He looked at me. "On the 41st floor, behind the kitchen, there's a service access shaft that runs to the building's utility level. It's not on the residential schematics. It's on the building management plans I pulled when I was cross-referencing the security coverage maps last week." I held his gaze. "Sarah Voss had access to your security architecture. She didn't have access to what I read in my own time for reasons nobody asked me to." A beat of silence in which I watched him perform the recalculation. "You memorized the building management plans," he said. "I was a waitress for 6 years," I said. "I always know where the service exits are." We moved. The hallway outside his bedroom was empty in the wrong way, not cleared, abandoned. The kind of empty that meant the people who should be there had been removed rather than reassigned. I didn't look at the details too carefully. I kept my eyes on the path and my hand on Malachi's arm and my mind on the 40 feet of corridor between us and the kitchen. We made it 20 feet before the stairwell door opened. 2 men, not the lean, practiced economy of Malachi's regular security, but something broader and less disciplined, the kind of physicality that substituted mass for precision. They came through fast and separated immediately, which meant they had been briefed on how he moved, which meant Sarah Voss had briefed them, which meant the intelligence they were operating on was 4 years deep and devastatingly current. Malachi moved toward the nearer one with the same terrible, unhurried efficiency I had witnessed in the diner, and I did what I had learned to do in the intervening weeks. I got out of the way and I watched and I processed the room for what he couldn't see from his angle. The 3rd man came from the kitchen. I saw him before he cleared the doorway. Taller than the others, something in his right hand that caught the emergency lighting and gave back a thin metallic reflection. He was positioned for Malachi's blind side, the left, the wounded side, the side that Dr. Ewan had spent 40 minutes repairing a week ago and that had not finished repairing itself. I was already moving. Not toward him. That would have been a category error. I had no illusions about the physics of that confrontation. I moved into the kitchen, and I moved fast. And I went directly to the counter where the heavy-based coffee pot sat in its cradle, because I had made coffee in this kitchen every morning for 10 days, and I knew exactly how much it weighed, and exactly how the cabinet door beside the entryway swung outward on its hinges, and exactly what happened when a heavy object met the edge of a door, swinging its speed into a man's dominant wrist. The sound was immediate and declarative. The metallic object hit the kitchen floor and skittered under the island, and the man folded over his wrist with an expression that moved through surprise and pain and arrived at something that looked very much like the recalibration of a plan. I put the coffee pot on the counter with a precision that was mostly adrenaline and said, with a calm I did not entirely feel, "Don't." He looked at me, really looked, the way people look when they are revising the taxonomy of a room and finding that a category they had marked as negligible is requiring reclassification. I looked back and thought about every difficult table I had ever approached, every room I had read before entering, every moment of making myself the kind of still that communicates that you have already decided and the deciding is over. He didn't move. Malachi appeared in the kitchen doorway. He took in the scene with a single sweep, the man cradling his wrist, the object on the floor, me standing at the counter with the coffee pot, and his expression did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in recent days. The thing that was not a smile but occupied the same address. He crossed to me and his hand found my jaw, tilting my face up with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the preceding 4 minutes, and examined a graze along my temple I hadn't noticed acquiring. "The service shaft," he said. "The service shaft," I confirmed. We went. The utility level was cold and lit by industrial strips and smelled of concrete and cable and the specific indifference of infrastructure, the building's true skeleton, stripped of all the amber light and curated silence of the floors above. I led him through it by memory, and he followed without question, which was the most extraordinary thing he had ever given me, and I understood it as what it was. Not trust as a calculated position. Trust as a thing that had been built, quietly and without ceremony, in the accumulated weight of 10 days of small and irrevocable proofs. We came out through the loading bay into the cold air of the street, and the city received us the way it always did, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, with the vast and democratic indifference of a place that has seen everything and annotates none of it. I looked at him in the sodium light, breathing hard, and he looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment that was full to its edges. Then his phone found a signal, and the world came back in, and the work of the aftermath began. But for that one moment, in the cold and the light, I let myself exist in the fact of what I had just done, not saved, not rescued, not performed a function in an arrangement. Chosen. Deliberately, at cost, with full knowledge of the consequences. And from the way he looked at me, the ink-covered hands and the deep-water eyes, and the man who wore his mother's geometry at his wrist, he knew the difference too. 3 weeks after the siege, Reyes received his communication. I wasn't in the room when it was sent, but I knew the moment it happened because Malachi came to find me in the study where I had been working, still working, a habit that had outlasted its original contractual basis, and set a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of me without ceremony. A formal closure document. My father's account. A column of figures that had governed the shape of my life for 8 months, and at the bottom, a 0 with a line drawn through it in ink so final it looked almost surgical. I looked at it for a long time. I had imagined this moment in the diner, during the long closing shifts when the exhaustion went hallucinogenic and my mind needed something to walk toward. I had imagined relief. The specific, physical relief of a weight lifted, the between-the-shoulders thing, the chronic bodily bracing that you stop noticing until it stops. I had imagined that 0 would feel like a door opening. It felt, instead, like a question. I set the paper down and looked at the study around me, the 2 laptops, the printed photographs that had been replaced 3 times now as the investigation moved through its layers. The coffee cup that had migrated from the kitchen because I worked better with it nearby, and at some point nobody had commented on that anymore. The room had accumulated the small evidence of my presence the way rooms do when a person has been in them long enough to stop being a guest. I didn't know precisely when that had happened. Malachi was leaning against the doorframe watching me read his face, and his face had the quality it carried now with increasing frequency, the unlocked quality, the door that had turned out not to be deadbolt after all. The temperature of a man who had stopped performing a range he didn't feel. "It's done," I said. "It's done," he confirmed. I nodded once and looked back at the zero and sat with the question it had produced instead of the relief I had expected. What are you now, Naira Soul, when the thing that was chasing you has been called off? What do you walk toward when you have spent so long running that forward and away have become the same direction? The purge had taken 11 days. Sarah Voss had been located through a chain of evidence I had helped build from the attendance records, cross-referenced against financial transfers that a woman in the East Quarter, one of Malachi's people, sharp-eyed and unhurried, had traced through 3 layers of holding company to a private account with Reyes fingerprints on its architecture. 2 of the 6 dinner suspects had been confirmed and removed. 3 members of the internal security team had been restructured out of the organization with the quiet, total efficiency of a man who had decided that the infection required excision rather than treatment. The gray-suited man from the gala had not been seen since the siege and was not expected to be. The organization that remained was smaller, cleaner, and oriented entirely around a center of gravity that had shifted. That shift had a name, and the name was awkward and unresolved, and neither of us had put it in a sentence yet, which was its own kind of sentence. Malachi straightened from the doorframe and crossed to the desk and sat in the chair across from me, not behind the desk, not in the power position, but across, the way you sit when you are talking to someone rather than conducting them. He placed an envelope on the desk beside the closure document. Thick, cream-colored, unsealed. I looked at it. "Open it," he said. Inside was a single card, heavy stock, printed with the Vale Group letterhead, and below it, in the clean architectural font of official documentation, a title, Director of Internal Intelligence. And below the title, a name. My name. I set the card down on the desk and looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at him. "This isn't a gesture," I said. "No. You're not offering me this because of what's between us." "What's between us," he said, carefully and directly, "is not a reason to offer you anything. What's between us is a separate matter from what you have earned, and I would ask you not to conflate them because I have no intention of doing so." A pause. "You identified 7 confirmed traitors in 22 days using pattern recognition that none of my trained personnel replicated. You extracted me from a compromised venue with a through-and-through wound and no resources. You outmaneuvered a fully briefed operative in my own kitchen with a coffee pot and the geometry of a cabinet door." The corner of his mouth moved, the ghost address, the outline of the smile. "The title is accurate. Not generous. Accurate." I looked at the card with my name on it. I thought about the diner, the linoleum and the amber light and the cheap shoes and the order slip torn in a moment of moral reflex that had cost me everything I'd had and turned out to be the only decision that mattered. I thought about my father, whose choices had written a story with my name in it that I had been trying to edit from the margins for years. I thought about what Malachi had said in the study, the night the tattoos became a language I could read. You chose what to do with yours. The debt was gone. The diner was gone. The girl who had stood at that counter at 2 a.m. with her secondhand shoes and her compulsive vigilance and her 4 words on a torn piece of paper, she was not gone, exactly, but she had been revised. Expanded. The vigilance was still there, the watching, the reading of rooms. It had just found a larger room. "There's a condition," I said. His expression did not change, but his attention sharpened in the particular way it did when something interested him. "The remaining restructuring, the security rebuild. I want a seat in those conversations. Not a brief afterward, not a summary. The room, from the beginning." I held his gaze. I see things in the architecture that your people miss. You know I do. I am not going to be useful to you from a distance. He looked at me for a long, steady moment. You're negotiating, he said. I'm always negotiating, I said. You should have established that earlier. The ghost at the corner of his mouth stopped being a ghost. It arrived fully, finally, with the unhurried completeness of something that had been waiting a long time for the right conditions, and it rearranged his face into something I had not seen there before. Not the recalibration, not the assessment, not the unlocked door warmth of the evenings on the sofa with the city below. Something that belonged only to this moment, to this desk, to the cream card with my name on it lying between us like a threshold neither of us had crossed yet, but both of us were standing at. He reached across the desk. Not for the card. For my hand, which he held with the careful, deliberate weight of a man who understood the difference between taking and choosing, who wore his mother's geometry at his wrist as a reminder that everything connects to everything else and no point is truly isolated, who had spent 10 days being read by a woman from a diner and had arrived, through that reading, at something he had not expected to find in himself. The room, he said, has always been yours. I looked at our hands on the desk, his ink covered, carrying the cartography of everything that had made him, mine bare, carrying the invisible record of everything that had made me. 2 different inheritances. 2 different kinds of survival. The same table. I turned my hand over in his and held it. Outside, the city ran through its frequencies, amber and indifferent and enormous, 40 floors below. The same city it had always been. The same lights, the same circuit board of signals stretching to the horizon, the same 2 a.m. turning somewhere in its grid into another night that would ask something of someone who wasn't ready. I was ready. I picked up the card with my free hand and held it and felt the weight of it, not heavy, not light, but present. Real. Mine in the specific and non-transferable way that things are yours when you have paid for them in the only currency that doesn't devalue. Naira Soul. Director of Internal Intelligence. Not the girl from the diner. Not just the woman who had saved him. Something new, with her own name on it, at the head of her own table. I kept the card. I kept his hand. And I didn't look back.